All right, all right, all right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, y'all out there. My name is Kendra Roberts, and I am the chair of Housing California and the vice president of operations for Human Good Affordable Housing. Welcome to the final day of the 2026 Annual Housing California Conference. I hope you all had an amazing day yesterday. As we head into the final, yes, clap it up. We had an amazing day yesterday. As we head into the final day of our conference, I want to thank everyone for bringing your expertise, for teams who took the time out of your important work to be in community with us. A special thanks to our sponsors, a special thanks to our title sponsor, U.S. Bank and Merit Community Capital Corporation, and J.P. Morgan. Please turn your attention to the screen for a short message from the J.P. Morgan team. All right, thank you, J.P. Morgan. We are looking forward to driving back in with all of you for another day of inspiration and networking. Across this conference, we have been reminded that the stories we tell and whose voices we elevate shape how we understand this crisis and how we imagine solutions. To help us ground in that spirit this morning, we are honored to welcome an artist who centers community, identity, and belonging. Please join me in welcoming Yosimar Reyes, Santa Clara County's current poet laureate and the City of San Jose's 2024 Creative Ambassador. Yes, clap it up for him. A writer, poet, and performer, Reyes is known for powerful storytelling that explores identity, migration, and community, bringing the experiences of undocumented and queer communities to stages and audiences across the country. Yosimar's work reminds us that storytelling can shift hearts, shape narratives, and help us imagine a more just future. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Buenos dias, good morning, everybody. Buenos dias, it's such a blessing to be here. My name is Yosimar Reyes. I'm a poet, I'm a writer. I write poems and stories about immigrants. I was raised in Eastside San Jose in an apartment complex inhabited by undocumented immigrants. Often when I speak of the concept of home, I think about home not necessarily as a building, but as the homes we create as strangers that come to this place and we become family trying to make it here. So this poem that I'm about to read today is titled A Place of My Own. I know right now it's a very turbulent time for immigrants, specifically undocumented immigrants. And so I try to write poetry and poems dedicated to the people that made me the poet I am today. So this is A Place of My Own. Someday, your parents will age in a country that has taken a toll on their bodies. Your mother's hands that once cleaned houses will tremble at the sink. Your father's knees that climb trees and balance on rooftops will refuse the ladder. Your mother won't be able to stand all day inside the factory anymore. Your father won't be able to set roofs under the burning sun. Sus cuerpos will grow smaller and smaller like candles that have given away all their light. Immigrants work like this with a quiet dream that one day, after enough years, after enough rent paid, after enough hours bent over someone else's life, they will purchase a plane ticket and return home. We tell ourselves that immigrant labor is our penance for the glory we will someday see. But sometimes, late at night, I realize this glory is just hope, and hope can be a fragile thing to build a life upon. Still, I carry a small dream like a seed in my pocket. One day, I will find my place in this world, a small plot of land where my life is not questioned, where no one will say I am invading, where my days are not suspended between fear of the future and the ghost of the past. I will build a home there with the warmth of my abuela's kitchen, the hunting laughter of my abuelo. The rain will fall softly on the roof, and for the first time in a long time, I will not feel lonely. One day, after all this labor, after all this waiting, there will be a place that is finally my own. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the morning.
Thank you, Yosimar, for grounding us in the human stories at the center of this work. I will now pass the mic to Julie Lowe, Housing California Department Deputy Director of Programs, who will moderate our closing plenary session with the newly relaunched Roadmap Home. This conversation will focus on the bold solutions needed to meet the scale of California's housing crisis. Let's welcome Julie.
Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're gonna have a great conversation with some lovely people. I'm just gonna start introducing them. So I'm honored to welcome some amazing partners to our work today. First, I'd like to welcome Jared Rivera, Interim Executive Director at Pico, California. Let's give him a round of applause. Next, I'd like to welcome Ben Grief, Executive Director of Evolve California. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Leah Rothstein, author, roadmap contributor, community organizer. Leah has been consulting with housing justice orgs focused on narrative lately. Please give everyone a round of applause. So as we get started, wanna ground us in our Roadmap Home. So our Roadmap Home was released earlier this year, and it lays out a 10-year strategy to create 1 million affordable homes, protect 3.1 million low-income renters, end homelessness, and close the racial equity gaps. Just those things. It does so through 4 primary pathways around providing immediate relief, addressing and repairing the racial harm, transforming the state's role in housing, and dramatically increasing revenue. These are things that for the last 2 days, the folks in this audience, this conference, many sessions have focused on some aspect of that. And today's conversation is how we move forward on the priorities laid out in the roadmap. And in many ways, the Roadmap Home is a lot of things. It's a hardcore policy document, Leah, you know this, that lays out the very specific policies of how we get there. But I think the Roadmap Home, at its best, is really calling a renewal to a movement of how we actually get this work done in the setting that we're in. And I think that is much of why we want to talk with folks like you who aren't specifically looking at housing and homelessness as these distinct issues, right? And so looking forward to a rich conversation. We're bringing these perspectives into this room because the challenges we're facing, the urgency, implementation, the federal panel yesterday, I think, was a stark reality of what we're in today. And, you know, I think anything that you can share with this audience, what you can bring into this room, what you can do to join this movement, will be extremely welcome. And so I'm gonna start off with you, Jared. Jared, Pico organizes directly with communities most impacted by housing stability and a multitude of system issues that surround that. You're working in congregations, you're working in neighborhoods, you're working in communities of color. What are you hearing right now about that urgency? I think we all know what is destabilizing communities, what's destabilizing families, but can you share a little bit from where you're sitting, what are the things that they need from us to know that the housing justice movement is about them as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Julie. Yeah, so PICO is a statewide faith-based organizing network. We work with about 500 congregations across the state. We're multi-faith, multi-race, multi-class, and multi-issue. So we work on a lot of issues, including housing. So I was thinking about this question about kind of what our folks are seeing on the ground, and the truth is they're seeing what we're all seeing. I mean, it's impossible to live in this state and not believe that our housing policy is fundamentally broken on some account. And so they're understanding all of that. But I would say for a lot of our folks, you know, whether they're undocumented or they're working poor, it's that stress of that rent check that's coming up every single month. It's the threat of their apartment building being bought by a developer and then having to figure out where they go. So it's people are acutely aware of like what's at stake. But I was thinking, you know, I was here on Wednesday for the lobby day, and we went out, shout out to Team 24, best team in the lobby visits, I hear. And we did a couple of visits with staffers, and we were kind of going over the talking points about, you know, the bond and some of the bills. And then we had one meeting with a member, I won't share what member that was, but just incredibly pointed, specific, technical questions that, thank God, Cesar Covarrubias from the Kennedy Center was in our group, and Jonathan and Joyce, because he was really able to handle these. And what I was thinking about in that visit, as somebody who is not, frankly, an expert on these policies, is what would my members have thought when they were in that room? I mean, our folks are experts on the pain and the problem, but when then they come here, it's difficult sometimes not to believe that it's complicated on purpose. It's because they, frankly, like me, it's very difficult to weigh into this, and you're seeing a broken system, and then you get tied into the minutia of all the different policies and ordinary people are not able to participate in that conversation. So I think the challenge for all of us is to build a big tent movement where we have handles and we have a vision, and that's why the roadmap is so useful for us to start to present a multi-year vision for our folks so that they can engage. But then the last thing that I'll say is, like, on most of the fights that we take on, whether that's immigration related or we're fighting for SNAP benefits or increased medical coverage, in most of those occasions, if our leadership is fighting for that issue, they're gonna directly benefit if we win that issue. Doesn't mean that those campaigns are easy to win, but immigration reform, they're gonna benefit from that, right? And then, but housing is complicated because you could spend your whole career organizing around housing, and that doesn't mean that you're gonna get into one of the units, right? That does not mean that you're gonna get in the lottery. So I think that is the challenge that we have, is building a movement that is broad enough. We can talk a little bit about what some of those other handles will be, but that's our challenge, is to keep our folks motivated and invested because they know it in their head, but they also know that there's no guarantee that they're gonna get the key to that front door.
Thank you, Jared. Ben, your organization has built a statewide movement around fully funding public schools and reforming structural revenue challenges that have constrained funding for communities for decades. Given the deep link between equitable public revenue systems and the capacity to fund affordable housing and homelessness, what should we, the folks in this room, our sector, our movement, folks that are saying they believe in housing justice, what should we keep in mind as what needs to be part of our strategy to move this movement forward for true structural reform?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you also for having me. It's exciting to be here to talk a little bit about what we really need to do moving forward, in my view. My organization is focused on reforming Prop 13 for the last decade or so. And this is something that's been thought about as the untouchable third rail of California politics. And when we first started our campaign, there were very few organizations out there that wanted to engage in Prop 13 reform. Actually, PICO was one of them, so shout out to you all for being involved. But this is something that the conventional wisdom, the political class here in Sacramento was like, you can't touch this issue. This is not something that we want to do. And I think that is the big issue, right? We cannot be bogged down by how things were. We need to have a bold vision for the future about what we want things to be. And this idea that with an issue like Prop 13 that is just impossible, well, we had a ballot measure in 2020 that got within 2 points of winning. It was the first time in over 4 decades that any attempt to reform Prop 13 in any significant way was on the ballot, and we were within 2 points during a pandemic. We did not get the support of a lot of people in Sacramento. We did not get the full-throated support of the current governor. And this is something that obviously hampers a campaign because they didn't want to think big. They didn't want to think this is something we can do. They wanted to buy into what they're hearing from each other in Sacramento, which is it's a third rail, we can't touch it. And so you can imagine how disappointing that is when you see we're the only state in the country that allows large commercial property owners to not pay fair market value property taxes. And when we look at the connection, and my organization focuses on education equity, that's sort of our main lane, but also we're talking about the housing sector as well now, because if you're a college student, the cost of tuition is not necessarily the big barrier now to completing 4 years of higher education. It's the cost of housing. But when we look at this system that allows Disneyland and Chevron to still be paying property taxes based on what their property was worth in 1975, and that we're losing hundreds of millions of dollars just from those 2 corporations, and to see a lack of political will from our elected leaders, that's something where it's like, well, how are we ever going to fund the roadmap? How are we ever going to do anything for renters in California? How are we ever going to build affordable housing if we don't have our leaders saying we need to do what every other state in the country does and fairly tax large commercial properties? And so I think what we need to do is we need to talk about bold ideas, we need to support bold ideas, and we need to get involved more in the political process in Sacramento and locally. And we need to hold our politicians accountable to what actually are they going to do to help several issues like build affordable housing. And we need to say, what are you going to do? Not platitudes, but where do you stand on this? Do you stand with the folks from PICO and the people they represent? Do you stand with the folks from Evolve California and the students and parents and teachers that we represent? Or are you standing with the California Apartment Owners Association? Right? And we need to ask those questions, and until we ask those questions, I don't think we're going to be able to achieve anything that most of us in the room would like to see achieved.
Thank you, Ben. Leah, you've helped shape the roadmap's long-term vision, so you know that document inside and out, particularly around structural change and racial equity. In this movement, in the times we are in very specifically, we're in a moment, maybe like one that we've never seen. What is it going to need to look like if California didn't just pass solid housing policy, but actively dismantled the inequities baked into the system? I think most people in this room know that those 2 things are inextricably linked. But would love your thoughts on what does that look like for us to do that today?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with that understanding that these are inextricably linked. We can't achieve the goals we want to achieve in terms of housing affordability and reducing homelessness, and sort of think that those wins will trickle down into reducing racial disparities if we're not intentional about addressing racial equity in those housing policies. So it can't just sort of be an add-on to the housing policies that we're advocating, racial equity goals. It can't be something separated from these goals and the challenges we face. So, you know, the racial disparities in our housing system, as we all here know, weren't caused by accident. They don't just sort of unhappen by accident either. So intentional policy created the racial disparities in our system. It was the same policies that created segregation that also created the lack of housing supply we see today, the lack of affordable housing, the increase in homelessness. All of these policies, you know, are intertwined. We can't now say, well, it's a hard moment, so we're going to separate them and just focus on these ones and hope that it trickles down to you know, reducing these disparities and fixing these problems too. It's not how it works. So we need to be intentional in the housing solutions and strategies that we advance and ensure that equity is a central part of those solutions. And you know, many of the policies in the roadmap do that. I won't get into them, but we have to be sure that these policies aren't neutral, that we're not sort of tempted by the moment when everybody's talking about housing supply and housing affordability. And maybe it feels easy to put aside these hard conversations of racial equity and focus on what we can do now in this moment that everybody's thinking and talking about housing. If we do that, we risk, you know, baking in those disparities even more, making them even bigger than they are today. So instead, we need housing policy that is focused on equity, that is reparative, corrective, and proactive on racial equity. And to do that, you know, we've spent a lot of time the last couple days talking about narrative, so it's really important as we talk about the housing challenges the state faces and the solutions we see we need, that we center equity in those conversations so that everybody understands that to achieve the goals we want in terms of housing affordability and reducing homelessness, you know, racial equity has to be a part of that, and we all will benefit when that is encompassed in our goals and strategies. It also means, you know, recognizing that this is a systems issue, that this didn't happen by accident, that history of, you know, our housing policy in this country, in this state, created these disparities on purpose. And when we understand that, we can understand that we have a chance, a moment, an opportunity, and an obligation to rework that system so that we can reduce those disparities, and that it takes system-wide thinking and also understanding of that history. And I know, you know, some people think that talking about, you know, the sort of painful history of our country isn't a way to motivate people to action. And I think that's true to an extent. I've spent, you know, several years traveling around the country talking about this history a lot, and it's difficult to talk about and to think about. And if you end there, it is deflating. You know, there's nothing we can do. We've inherited this terrible system. The disparities are baked in. We're hopeless and helpless in the system. But if you talk about that history and then give people something to do about it, it's really motivating. People are like, okay, that is terrible, that what we've inherited, what we're living with, but here's something I can do to challenge it and to redress and repair for that history and reduce those disparities today. I'm on board, I'm gonna do something about it. So I think we can't lose that historical context, but we have to pair it with action and what we can do today. And we know what works, and we know that there are ways to reduce those disparities, so we have to keep our focus on that. Even though it's hard, maybe harder today than ever, I don't think we really have a choice if we want to see something different.
Thank you, Leah. I'm going to stick with the theme of the moment that we're in. And so in recent years, we've made some good progress. Production has increased. The roadmap cites 18,000 units, roughly, rough and ready, is being produced on an annual basis. We know we have a long way to go. There have been some good movement in the tenant protections at the state level. But we're at a time again where we have budget deficits, we have a new governor coming to town, we've got God knows what's happening at the federal level. There's a couple bright spots happening in California. I think folks in this room have been very active in the conversation about the state's one-stop shop, right? The state's new agency intended to bring executive branch focus on housing and homelessness as a distinct issue. part of what I'm thinking about is how do we, there are these bright spots in the systems, and we all work here at the systems level. How do we balance the progress we made at a system level with the things that the people and communities are facing in terms of their own immediate harm? Like what is our movement obligated to do to communicate how those things are related? And I'm going to go to you, Jared, because of your work.
Yeah, so I started my career with PICO, and then I left for 15 years. Most of that time was in the labor movement, and then for 2 years before I came back to PICO, I worked in City Hall in LA. So a lot of the way I view the work, it's going to be through the lens of how voters, frankly, receive, information. And if anybody wants to be terrified about the future of our democracy, sit in a focus group and listen to how voters kind of like take in that stuff. I mean, I honestly can't recommend it enough. I mean, it is a sobering check on, how people receive information. And so, look, the time that I spent in LA, I was over our community engagement program, and it was a scarring period in my life because I was just the complaint department for the city, and voters are pissed. I mean, the anger that's out there around street homelessness and encampments, and I could sit there and talk about all the work that we were doing, and I believe strongly in the work that we were doing, both in the city and then collectively. But that doesn't change when someone calls up and says, there's an RV, there's 2 RVs in the front of my house, what can I do? And so, it lends itself to all kinds of ugliness and all kinds of stereotypes about who the unhoused are. But I do think we need to really think about the fact that we have a credibility problem when it comes to big issues. Because if people look out their window and they don't see change, it's very difficult to come back and say, well, now we want a $10 billion, bond. So I think focusing on that level, in my opinion, is very important. And then the other thing I'll say, as it relates to kind of animating like our base, is that I think this is right, Julie, that 1 million people live in affordable housing, a deed-restricted unit in California, out of 40 million people. So most folks will not be their experience, and probably most folks will not know someone necessarily that is living or benefiting from all the work that we're doing. So it's really this kind of vague thing that's out there, which is why I think the narrative work is so crucial, because we know that most people are not going to understand that kind of, or that's not going to be their experience, but we need to find ways to tell stories about how those system changes are impacting what's happening at the local level as it relates to street homelessness, as it relates to the supply side that's going to bring rents down and all that kind of work. I think we as a movement, I think, are really good on the technical side, but I think we need to really focus in on narrative and think about how people digest it. And then just maybe the last thing I'll say is I know we have folks in this room that are developers. I know that we have some tenants' rights folks that are here too, and I know there are other conferences that are tenants' rights focused, but I just think we have got to find a way to message all of this together, because like I said before, if I'm not ever going to live in one of these units, but I am going to know if there is policy passed at my city or at the state that's going to lower my rent, right? And we have a rent cap which is, was touted by politicians in the state, around the country, and it's an important first step. It's also maxing out at 10%, which it also means that in 3 years my rent could go up 30%. So we have got to find ways to chip away at that, and I think it's a difficult thing. It's difficult to pass some of the funding challenges that we have. It's difficult to pass the tenants' rights protections. We've got to find a way to do it together to get to the movement on scale that we need to continue the success.
Leah, I'm wondering if you can give the question a crack. I'm mindful that in touring the country in support of your book, Just Cities, you've been all over, and you're hearing from community members their take, both on California and the issue that they might be facing that's similar in their own areas, and curious what you're seeing as potential places to bridge that.
Yeah, well, to add on to what Jared said, I think it's important, especially here in California, and it's not unlike what every community is facing around the country, is holding these two truths that we need long-term strategy to change systems, to increase revenue, to have ongoing sustainable funding for the solutions that we know work, but also short-term immediate relief strategies that show people that our policymakers care about what they're struggling with today and that people can stay in their homes today. So we need to balance both of those focuses, not only to build up political support for the longer term vision, but also to help people deal with their, the struggles of right now. And that's difficult everywhere. I do talk about this all around the country, and it's not easy anywhere, and I don't try to say that it is, and nobody believes it is. They come to me thinking I'm going to have some easy answer. It's hard work everywhere, but it's important work and it's necessary work. And I think especially, what the roadmap emphasizing the need for this ongoing revenue source that's consistent and reliable, that is really key to making sure that all of the other strategies that we know work can actually be allowed to work. And so I know we'll get into that a little bit more, but keeping the focus on that while also, paying attention to the needs of today, having a narrative that includes the systems level focus. I think that some of the gains California has achieved is because of a statewide systems focus on housing. And so we need to maintain that. And we need to, make sure our state leadership maintains that focus also, hold them accountable to that. We aren't going to get out of this with piecemeal solutions and 1 year of funding for this solution and for that solution. And we need to really bake that into all of the narrative, all of our organizing and advocacy.
Ben, the roadmap's 4 pathways are designed to work together. So immediate relief without long-term investments is insufficient. I think folks in the education realm really understand this as well. And of course, production without equity deepens our disparities, as Leo had spoken to. And revenue without accountability doesn't guarantee our impact. And I think a lot of conversations in the last few days have really focused on that. So I want to ask you, as someone who's coming from an adjacent sector, one that we would assume would be under the same tent. Change rarely happens all at once. And from where you're looking at what we're doing, in your view, what needs to happen first to unlock, understanding that the roadmap is a multi-year policy agenda? Some things we can do now, some things are going to take a lot more work, but we can get there. What are the near-term things that we need to lay down to be able to get us to that long-term arc?
Yeah, I think that's a great and important question. I do want to say something about sort of the rent cap being at 10%, and we had an opportunity with AB 1157 to bring that down to 5% in the legislature this year, and it got killed. 5 Democrats, were able to kill that, and we need to ask why. Why do we think it's okay to have a 10% rent cap in the most expensive state in the country? Right? And so who are these people that are killing this? Why are they killing it? And why are they not understanding the needs of millions of renters all across California? I mean, our state is losing population, right? So we fret about Donald Trump. Oh no, we lost an electoral vote. Well, what are we doing to change that here in California? Nothing, right? We are not making this a more affordable place to live. We are not making this somewhere where people feel like my elected officials have my best interest in mind, right? And so I think that's just something I wanted to address. I think in terms of what we need to do is we need to all get involved and support in whatever way we can, depending on what sector we come from, in long-term, year-round organizing. Because it is difficult when you're sitting in a focus group And I've participated in focus groups, you know, our campaigns have had those, and yes, it's kind of scary how people receive information, but it's because our entire system, our political groupthink, our mainstream media, our disinformation that we have going on now, it puts ideas in people's minds that are false. And we need to do something to combat that. And I think we do a really good job of throwing down millions of dollars around election season and working to get our folks out, knocking on doors and talking to people during those times. But we fail to do that same critical work between election cycles when it matters the most. And I think that is important to be talking about, right? Why are we spending so much money around elections when we kind of know we already lost the issue because we haven't been doing the year-round organizing, right? And so we're throwing away money, right? Because we're not doing the requisite pre-work that we need to do to change minds before it's on the ballot. Any political consultant knows it's won or lost prior to the fall, right? There are a few exceptions, but other than that, it's long-term, grassroots, year-round organizing to change minds. And when you're actually out there talking to people, they have a very different view of things than the people in Sacramento do. They know what's going on, they're frustrated, and they're looking for leaders that have a bold vision. I understand we had some gubernatorial candidates here yesterday. Why are they all not coming out in full-throated support of a wealth tax? I don't know. Do we not have a deficit? Are we not worried all the time on what the federal government is going to do to take money away from California, and we're doing nothing to actually protect ourselves from that? And we have to ask why. So long-term year-round organizing and really asking why the folks that were sitting up here yesterday were not wholeheartedly behind this idea.
So I'm going to switch topics a little. So one of the deeper questions embedded in the roadmap home is how California understands homelessness, Californians' understanding of homelessness in the first place. So folks in this room know that for decades, we've treated homelessness primarily as a local crisis to manage, something for cities and counties to respond to through patchwork programs. But if homelessness is driven by the crisis of affordable housing, high housing costs, poverty, disability, and gaps in the safety net, it raises a different possibility. And what sits underneath the pillar in the roadmap of transforming the state's role is a simple question. What would need to happen if homelessness and housing weren't primarily a local governance issue at all? What if it's actually part of the state's core safety net responsibility? Similar to how we think of education, Ben. And if that were true, the state's role would shift from being an episodic grant maker to something much bigger. And I think this is why the notion of a state agency focused on housing and homelessness has become very exciting to our field. What if the state were a revenue guarantor, a systems integrator, equity enforcer, and a performance steward? I think that would move us from moving from today's patchwork response to where every Californian can rely on a baseline in their housing response. And I think this brings us, I wanted to contextualize that because it's going to bring us to one of the hardest questions we raised in the roadmap. We know that solving the crisis at scale requires sustained long-term investment, and the funding gap today is significant. So I want to close our conversation to ask you guys this. From where you sit, the things, I think we all know what the challenges are. I'm really curious if you can give us some hope. We need to hear some glimmers of what this might take to build the political will to generate sustained long-term revenue for housing and homelessness in a way that not just folks in this room, not just the legislative staff that we have a relationship with might know, but in a way that voters and decision makers believe is both possible and transformative. And Leo, I'll start with you.
All right. Well, like you said, I think we have to begin with understanding, like people have to understand that change is possible and understand what that change is that we're talking about. So we talk about revenue streams. not that, maybe to some people in this room that's really interesting, revenues and budgets and tax law, but for most people, they hear revenue streams and they tune out. But what we're really talking about when we talk about increased revenue, ongoing revenue streams to fund housing, is we're talking about what kind of communities we want to live in. What kind, how we want to feel in our neighborhoods, who our neighborhoods serve, what our future looks like, how it feels in our home with our families, and how we as a community, as a state, show our values through what those communities look like and what we invest in. And so we have to really be conscious of that when we're talking about this. The revenue piece of the roadmap is essential to funding everything else. But when we're talking about that with people outside of this room, we need to really center that, what that revenue stream supports. And that's our vision for a future California where everyone has an affordable place to live. And if we can center that in how we think about it, I think we can bring more people on board. This conference has been so informative the last, couple of days. So many opportunities to talk about all of these issues and think about them and look at the numbers and, talk about how we talk about it and like all of this heady stuff about how much funding we need and what it will fund and how. And if you stop for a moment, in all of this thinking and talking and just like sit and think, like in 10 years, if in my community in 10 years, everyone had a place to live that they could afford, like what would that feel like to walk around my neighborhood, to know that everyone was stable in their homes, that nobody is forced out of a home to live on the street? Like that feeling is what we need to hold on to when we talk about revenue. And that feeling, that vision is more exciting and more motivating and can bring more people on board to these important kind of heady, policy wonky conversations. But we have to remember that bridge, that we're talking about something bigger and more personal than a budget.
Ben, what's your take?
I think, in agreement, so we need a bold vision, right? That's what we need. We need our leaders to say, this is what we need to do. We might not achieve it now, but this is the roadmap to achieving it in the future. And right now, and again, I very much understand that we have to work within the system that we're working within. And so while I support some of the piecemeal changes, and I understand it would be good to get a bond measure passed to get some money going, that's not the end-all and be-all, right? That cannot be the one revenue measure that we have at the statewide level. That just is totally unacceptable. I think we have to really look at the idea that individuals out there, voters out there, are feeling nickeled and dimed, right? And by avoiding a wealth tax, by avoiding corporations paying their fair share, billionaires paying their fair share, we then have transferred the tax burden onto individuals, right? Where we have the second highest gas tax in the country, we have the highest income tax in the country, we have the highest sales tax in the country, and voters are being nickeled and dimed with local bond measures and parcel taxes every single year. And so the idea that we're not going to tap into a limitless well of revenue from those that can afford it the most, and we're going to continue to pick away at money from low-income, working-class people, middle-class people's pockets, doesn't make any sense. That's actually counterproductive, right? What we need to look at, if anyone has looked at the latest polls and is a little surprised and shocked and scared that the Republican candidates for governor are polling so well, it's because we don't have a bold vision. Right? Who is and where is a Zoran Mondami in California? Where? Please. We need to think about these things. If we're not inspiring people, if we're not offering a bold vision, if we're not saying we need to do something the rest of the country does and reform Prop 13, and I know when we talk about Prop 13, people get scared, but if we educate them, if we have people from the bully pulpit, right, from the Assembly, from the Senate, from the governor's mansion saying it's not about homeowners, it's just about commercial property owners, the Disneylands and the Chevrons. If we have someone that was able to do that, we could change people's minds. And that's really what we need to do. We need to get behind candidates that maybe don't have the best chance of winning. Maybe running against someone that's in a Sacramento insider that is representing the status quo. But as long as we get behind these other people that are willing to do something differently, then we can build that movement. And voters are hungry for that. Voters of California want that. And what the powers that be, what the status quo says voters want is very, very untrue. So we need to commit, like I mentioned before, to long-term grassroots organizing. We need to hold the folks in Sacramento accountable, and we need to ask a simple question. Since we've had the governor's mansion and a 2/3 supermajority of Democrats in the state legislature, what significant policy have we put forth and passed that changed people's lives in any significant way? And we need to answer that question. The answer is nothing. And we need to say, why? How are we okay with this? And what can we do starting today to make it so the next 10 years, if we have the supermajority and a Democrat in the governor's mansion, what are we going to do to make people's lives better in California? Thank you.
Well, I think Julie Lowe is our Mamdani here in California, so that's who I'm putting my money on. There we go. Yeah, I mean, just a couple thoughts. I mean, one, maybe I'll just like, you think about kind of the hopefulness. I mean, there's an anecdote that comes to mind about, again, my time at the city. You know, the reality in engaging with neighborhood groups and neighborhood councils is that what you would hear all the time is, you know, get the homeless out of my neighborhood. Just don't house them there, right? I mean, just take care of it as long as you put them anywhere else. And so a lot of the fights that we would get into would be around, you know, the city was purchasing hotels and converting them into, you know, interim housing. And then each time that would happen, it would be a big battle. And so, you know, there was one in particular in downtown that was getting, you know, a lot of heat. And so we just started taking neighbors on tours of the facility. And it was, frankly, like even the people who were really against this, it was very difficult for them to look at this and not think that this is where we need to go. I mean, it's a 10-story building. There's a medical, you know, on the second floor. There's drug and alcohol treatment that's going on. There's job assistance programs that are happening. I mean, it is, and you walked in and, you know, people expected that they were going to walk into chaos. And you walked in and it was the quietest hotel you'd ever been in, right? And so, I mean, I think that's to you know, Ben's point about kind of the ongoing organizing. I mean, I think we believe that the solution to these problems is proximity, is how close can we bring one another to the pain? How close enough can we bring one another to the realities of this? Because when it's just technical, it just, most people are going to kind of, you know, tune out from that, you know. So I think that, you know, the more we can do that in communities around the state, I think, and I've seen that, and that gives me a lot of hope. And then the other thing that gives me hope too is, you know, I talked about, you know, the work that I did in the labor movement, and I know as a kind of a collective body, and with, you know, in SHAC, we're doing a lot of outreach to labor. And to like Ben's point about not being able to get that bill out of committee, labor could have moved that if they wanted to. Labor could have moved 5 Democrats if they identified this as a key point. And it's tricky, because I know at my union, SEIU 2015, we would regularly poll our members and just ask them, what's the most important issue to you? What issue do you want your union working on? And it was always, you know, a tie at the top: wages and benefits and housing costs, every time. The challenge I think we have for labor is that, again, labor's orientation is, I'm going to secure a right and I'm going to put it in a contract, and you're going to get access to that right because you're a member of this union. And as I've said before, we can't make those guarantees with housing in the same way. But I think we all know that there are sections of unions. There's the trade unions. There's the carpenters, that their membership is tied to the construction of housing. But I'm really interested in kind of the CTAs and the SEIUs and the UFCW who know that they cannot keep pace at the bargaining table with rising rent costs. So I think, but I also know being on that side, they get confused by the asks when we come in there, that they don't have a clear idea, and because it's not their top issue, I think we lose them sometimes. So I think we're building those relationships, which I think is really important, but I think we need to be really clear about clarity with them. Can we articulate a clear vision, a simple vision that we can invite them into?
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Ben, and thank you, Leah. We covered a lot today. Want to encourage folks to go to the Roadmap Home website. We have a Roadmap Home activation booth here in the expo hall. And before we wrap up, please give our panelists another round of applause. So I'm going to transition us to our sponsor, Wells Fargo, who will be sharing a very special announcement. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Darlene Goines, Executive Vice President of Philanthropy and Community Impact with Wells Fargo.
Thank you, Housing California. I hope you all have had an amazing experience here at this conference. And really, as we think about solving California's housing challenges, it's really going to take a lot of innovation, and it's going to take all of us working together across policy, funding, and innovation to advance the housing sector. So that's what I'm here to share with you today. How can we all support housing innovation? Well, today, Wells Fargo is announcing the 2026 Housing Affordability Breakthrough Challenge, which is a nationwide competition in collaboration with enterprise community partners. This challenge is designed to do one important thing: identify affordable housing solutions that are already working and help them scale their impact to more communities. 5 organizations will each receive $2 million in grant funding, along with technical assistance, one-on-one industry mentorship, and participation in a national peer learning cohort. So we are looking for ambitious, thoughtful ideas in design and construction, smarter financing models, and services that support long-term stability for residents. Ideas that really propel the housing sector forward and challenge the status quo. Since 2019, Wells Fargo and the Wells Fargo Foundation have invested more than $53 million in the Housing Affordability Breakthrough Challenge, supporting ideas that are already changing the housing landscape. Past winners have launched scalable modular housing systems, pioneered new underwriting models, and developed groundbreaking programs supporting reentry housing, tribal home ownership, and rural community development. And we've seen what happens when promising concepts get the right support. They move faster, they reach more people, and they influence systems beyond their original footprint. To enterprise community partners, our partner administrating this national challenge, thank you for your leadership and for being on this journey with us. Your expertise helps ensure that we reach innovators across rural and urban communities. And to all the innovators, practitioners, and problem solvers out there, if you're working on innovative housing solutions that are ready to grow, we want to hear from you and learn from you. We want to share your story. Applications open on Enterprise's website on April 1st. Both nonprofit and purpose-driven for-profit organizations are invited to apply. And what excites me about this program is that It's an invitation to really reimagine housing. It's that hope that we talked about in that last panel to give more people an affordable place to call home. So together we can add to the blueprint for change and help modernize the housing sector here in California and across the country. So I hope that you will join us. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to invite Shioni to the stage.
Good afternoon. We're not quite done yet. Thank you to our wonderful moderator, our sponsors, and our panelists for joining us for this plenary and discussion on the Roadmap Home. Over the last couple days, I have been reminded in some really painful ways, but also in some deeply inspiring ways, that our work is not about any one individual, but it's really about all of us and how we come together to keep things moving forward. We are super excited as a team to deepen our collective commitment to the newly relaunched Roadmap Home and hope you will all join us in moving that forward. It's ambitious work. We all know it's ambitious work, but there's never been a more important moment to put our communities on a path towards this change. Before we close out today and move to the remainder of the conference, I want to provide a few closing thoughts and recognize the hardworking people who have made this program possible. First, please join me in a round of applause to thank all of our conveners, speakers, conference planning committee members, sponsors, partners, our wonderful board of directors, our consultants, volunteers, and all of you, our participants, for taking this journey with us as we work together to create a California with homes, health, and prosperity for every single one of our neighbors. Please also thank the convention staff, the hotel staff, who have made our gatherings possible and have taken care of all of us over the last 3 days. And last but not least, I want to invite my amazing team at Housing California to join me on this stage. Please, if you see these folks in the hall, thank them. They have been working for a year to make sure that we have a successful event, and I just feel so incredibly grateful that I get to go to work with these amazing people every day. We hope you've found inspiration, made new connections, and gained new ideas and knowledge to help you continue this critical work in California and beyond. We also want to hear what you think about the conference, so please complete our end of conference survey through the Whova app. I've heard there are some prizes. Lori is great about making sure we always have fun with these things. And last but not least, we're looking forward to seeing all of you at our 48th annual conference next year, which will be taking place on May 4th through 6th in 2027. That'll be here in Sacramento again. Where lunch is getting started, we have a buffet for all of you in the exhibit hall, so find a place to eat, enjoy each other, and then join our final round of workshops that will be starting at 1:30. We won't be back in this room again, so I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and a safe trip home. Thanks for coming.